everyone, and welcome to the Truth and Data Podcast, where we deep dive a different digital forensics topic each week. I'm Jessica.
I'm Debbie. Nope. Of course, I knew that was going to happen at some point. We need.
That's all good. So, what's the topic today? Today, we're talking about what happens on scene and how that really affects what happens back at the lab in the exam. And so we have a couple of different areas that are really important here that we're going to deep dive into. Some are logistical, some are very technical, and they all affect what the end result is in the exam. And so let's dig into it, right? So the first thing that when we were prepping for this session that Debbie mentioned was these concept of planned versus unplanned. Do you want to kind of talk to what
Sure,
you meant by
absolutely.
that?
So, if we're talking about on-scene collections, that can happen in a variety of ways. So, it could be a planned event, whether that's likely a search warrant or someone, if it's not necessarily law enforcement, someone bringing devices to an office, something like that.
An audit, for example.
Exactly. So, and then say unplanned events. So crime scenes of some sort, disasters of some sort, where digital evidence needs to be processed. So, the concept of planned or unplanned. And I think we need to be ready for both.
Right. So this whole concept of, is this a planned warrant that we're going to execute on this person's house? We know what we expect to find. Our warrant clearly dictates this, this, and this, and we're knocking on the door at 5 a.m. Or,
Right.
when I worked at EY, we would go out. We knew we were doing a collection. Sometimes it would be something like, you know what, all of the salespeople are going to come to this salesperson meeting, and we're going to update their devices. And then you're actually imaging and pulling the data as part of a collection because there's something that is suspected that's wrong. But that's
And the more you go ahead.
no, I was going to say, in those conditions, it's really, really easy to plan what gear do I need, what equipment do I
Right.
need, what personnel do I need, and really have it. But then when you're talking about the unplanned, if you're talking about response to an incident that's just happened, an intrusion on a network, or if you're talking something like the Pulse nightclub shooting,
Right.
right? Where unexpected, middle of the night, lots of victims, lots of devices, how do we respond?
Well, in speaking from a law enforcement perspective, the more planned events that you do, the more prepared you are for the unplanned events. And in law enforcement, we are always, our job really is to be prepared to handle unplanned events. So, being prepared, even though it is an unplanned event, I still feel as though we need to be prepared for those and ready to go.
We need to
Yes,
plan
we need to
for the
plan.
unplanned.
Right, exactly.
We need to have that whole concept. All right, so we're at the scene, regardless of if it's planned or unplanned. Kim, what are kind of your thoughts on how do you even identify what on scene we need to collect, right? And how does that help affect us downstream?
Right. So I think, first and foremost, obviously, by the time that an examiner goes into the scene, obviously it's been secured, especially if you have civilian examiners, you waited till everything's been secured, everything's been taken care of, from an emergency perspective. Right. And then when it comes time for an examiner to, be able to go in, and sometimes the examiner may not even go inside. Right. Like a lot of folks have, and a lot of agencies have, some mobile vans and things of that nature. They've got outfitted pretty well that they can do an exam or some triaging outside of the home or business that they're going in. So, which is very helpful so that you don't have to try to do a lot of work inside the scene. Right. So, but by the time that an examiner goes in, that's usually where we're just trying to help identify what may be of interest to us from a data perspective and what may have some data on it that could help us. And also in a protection of data that may be getting ready to be spoiled by some way. So the other part is that oftentimes, and depending on the agency and depending on how this is organized within this group that's going in for this and that's taking care of the scene, is that, and especially if it's an unplanned scene, it may be a little bit chaotic, right? So the communication is huge there. And I know Debbie and I've had this conversation before. Communication is huge there, where you have to be able to speak to folks to say, this is potential evidence, this is potentially evidence. And for us to identify those devices, then they may have their own things they need to do, such as maybe video it exactly where it is,
Right.
document it on a log exactly where that it is and where it was encountered, who encountered
sees it? Yes.
who unplugged it, who touched it first, what was plugged into it. So that's really where my mind goes first, is let's go in and identify it after everything's safe. Let's go in and identify, figure out what that is, notify whom you need to. And then once we get to a point where we've identified those things, then you can start to be the examiner again from the data perspective and start to maybe potentially look at this data or triage it.
And prioritize which ones you're going to do first.
Identifying can sometimes be difficult. You know, I love all of the agencies that have the electronic sniffing detection dogs, the ESD canines, Siri and Bear and ASCII and all of our friends who are furry but do this work, because some of the items can be very, very, very small, right? I have a hideaway water bottle, not handy right now, that I use when I'm teaching classes. In person with my grad students at GMU, and I drink from the water bottle the whole lecture. And then they have a scene where they have to collect the evidence, and I always put the water bottle on. It's a hideaway water bottle. Inside, you know, you can put an SD card, but how easy is it for someone to walk out drinking water? You wouldn't even think of it. I love those canines, but it's not just the small things, right? What about the Internet of Things devices? We're not just collecting phones and computers anymore. We actually Hexordia has been involved in a really cool project. It was a DOJ funded project that we're doing in partnership with Oklahoma State University. And it had 2 phases. The first phase was started actually by VTO. And then we came in when VTO had retired from the project. And what was done were documents for how to acquire data from 40 plus devices. That's accessible via a portal for anyone in law enforcement, because it was a DOJ funded project. Sorry, everyone else. But we'll put the link to that in the show notes. But then what's really cool is the second phase, which we're in right now. We'll be putting up the analysis documents from that. And the whole goal of that project is to determine which devices does it make sense to acquire on scene. Where are we actually going to get relevant data from the physical hardware? Where might we have trouble with things like Lux encryption, which is on a lot of these devices? And where are the devices that actually have valuable data on the physical device? And how do we acquire it? And where is the data? So we've had this whole cool project about that. And something else neat as part of that phase 2 is we're actually doing a couple of courses live in person for law enforcement, and we're building an on-demand curriculum that'll be free and open to law enforcement in the U.S. So keep your eyes out for that. If you're on our mailing list and you have a .gov, you're going to get an email about those classes coming up, because I think they start in June. I don't know when the on-demand will be live, but the team's been working diligently on that project, and it's just something people don't necessarily think about. So we really want to educate on what to acquire on scene. And don't worry, even though those classes are only for law enforcement, we are putting together good content that we'll be sharing with the rest of the community about devices of value and how to deal with those devices as well.
I know, as someone who would go on scene to do exactly what we're talking about, that research is going to be incredibly valuable, because there are times where we were looking at devices and we were like, we don't know if it has data on there that's going to be valuable to us or not.
Sarah Hayes, who's part of our team, she's actually working on that IoT project. She just did a whole big presentation at B-Sides Rock. We'll put the link for that too, on just what you can get off the Aura Ring. I mean, that's from the app and from the cloud more so than the device itself, mainly because they're titanium and hard to get into. But, just the amount of data you can get from some of these IoT devices is
That's insane. So cool.
Yeah.
So cool.
Maybe we'll do you know what? Well, let's put on the schedule. We'll do an episode on IoT
Wearables.
forensics and wearables. Yeah, and maybe we'll have Sarah on that. So I'm just making a note
Making
on that.
notes.
Making notes for future episodes. See, y'all, we record this, but we do it live. All right, so now we've got all these things collected. Let's talk about the crux of this, right? Which is loss of data. And I would ask people, if we just did 2 weeks ago, we did a cool episode. Episode 1 was on acquisition is preservation and how important timely acquisition is. So I really encourage you to check that out, specifically in regards to some of the issues with mobile. But let's just talk about how collection can destroy accessibility to data, right? Recoverability. So, the type of collection that matters, right? Is it an AFU collection? Is it a BFU collection? Is it a full file system image? And for folks who aren't familiar, AFU would mean after first unlock, and BFU means before first unlock. So a BFU collection means that the device has been rebooted and a password hasn't been entered. This could be because a user reboots their device. And I'll be honest, I just came back from international travel. Before I cross any border, I reboot my phone so it's in the off state. So if they turn it on, it's BFU, because I know data availability is different. And also when I travel internationally, I might use my Face ID and my short PIN while I'm domestic, but when I'm overseas, I change everything to a long worded password. Personal preference. Everybody can do what they want, but
I have to change my processes.
I
put something in my head now that
I don't know the rules in other countries, and if they're going to look at my device or not when I cross a border.
Right.
So I just make it so that it's harder, right? I'm not trying to hide anything. I just don't want it to be easy.
Understood.
Yeah. So in terms of that, the state of the device really, really, really matters. You get less data if a device is BFU. And if a device is AFU after first unlock, modern commercial technology methods do allow on some devices for 90% of user data to be collected without knowing the passcode. It doesn't need to be brute forced. It doesn't need to be broken into. The data is available to the device, and some commercial tools out there take advantage of it. And that's fantastic. It's a fantastic capability if you have, again, legal authority to be asking the device. And I should say everything we discuss here, our baseline is that whoever's doing this work is as a digital forensics practitioner and has verified their legal access. Kim, you want to talk a little bit about network isolation?
Sure. So I think one of the big things that we would often do when we would go into like a planned scene is that, if there were not just the people, but all the devices, to try to make sure that all the devices aren't necessarily talking to one another, but were often more than one person at that location. So, more so now, I guess people have their own individual iCloud accounts and things along those lines. But prior to then, or to now, people have been sharing, I feel like, a lot of iCloud accounts, especially like with children. If you're going to look, if you're looking at a victim's phone, then, maybe perhaps, it's a shared iCloud account that, everyone is, in the house is using the same iCloud account, which, by the way, we've had several cases that's how we actually found out about some bad things that were going on, because photos were shared through iCloud. But it also gives the opportunity for someone to go delete something on someone else's behalf,
yep.
Or just being afraid that someone's going to see something, or just to try to help someone out. But also the whole Internet of Things, the fact that so many devices, and I gave the example of iCloud, it's not just, Apple device to Apple device, right? Everything's connected to everything now. So if everything is connected to your network and has the potential of interacting, and everyone's device there has that option of interacting with those devices, then you need to isolate everybody's device, and at least until you can clear it, and at least until you can make sure that something is not being lost, for lack of a better way to say it, or sometimes on purpose, sometimes maybe not. But also your Internet of Things, if you've got a really, really good technical person that's, a techie that's set things up and, kind of is always kind of paranoid that somebody's going to see something of theirs. I mean, they may have some kill commands set up that they could have, which some of your IoT devices could be listening for.
It could even be, though, that you're sharing pictures or photo albums with your TV set. And then from your TV, you could, if your TV hasn't been seized, you could potentially be deleting those from the iCloud account, even while the device is seized.
We took several TVs.
Because you're logged in.
Yeah. Just because you're logged in and connected to the same account. And then if the device isn't imaged for 30 days, because we can just go into that with time, if devices are seized and not imaged immediately, we have all the things we talked about in episode 1, right? We've got these change in states, we've got these devices rebooting, we've got all of these issues, but then you add on top of it that just labs are backed up, the case isn't a priority, it gets imaged 2 months down the road after it's been in custody. Those images that have even been requested to be deleted, they're going to sit there in the deleted folder for 30 days, but then they're truly gone right after that. And there's so much data that can be captured these other ways. I'll mention something I heard about on Digital Forensics Now. So this recording is happening on April 11th. And last night, April 10th episode of Digital Forensics Now, they were discussing a paper that we'll also put in the references that spoke to the availability of unified logs in full file systems. And it's really important that we're looking at order of operations on scene so that we don't lose data. So it would be suggested to trigger sysdiagnose logs first, then capture unified logs and sysdiagnose logs. There is a free tool from Hexordia. There's UFADE that's out there. There are tools that can do that, that can extract those logs. But you'd want to extract those logs if you have the passcode before doing the full file system acquisition. And actually just creating sysdiagnose logs is helpful. And then you've got like the research that MSAB has been doing on RAM and what they're able to capture and pull out of RAM. So now we're talking about on scene needing to get that as quickly as possible. So you want to trigger a sysdiagnose log, which is something we recommend now in our courses, but also the SWGDE just put out a draft on best practices for evidence handling and acquisition. If there's one paper I want people to go look at from this conversation, it's that. And that's because it's in draft and I want people to respond and give feedback to SWGDE so we can make it better. But we call out on there both log capture, so sysdiagnose logs, unified logs, but also memory. And so for these phones, now we're talking about putting a phone in the freezer so that you can acquire the most amount of data from it. How crazy is that?
That is, something else. And, we're throwing out a lot of things that we got to consider, right? Mm-hmm. But you've also, if this is a situation where you're going to, what if you indeed do have the search warrant and that's why you're there and you are anticipating finding some type of evidence so that they can go ahead and effect the arrest, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you may have to, depending on several things, you may end up having to take the evidence with you. And then after there's an exam done, then you would be able to, maybe the arrest would happen later on. A lot of things can happen between those 2 points, right? So we would oftentimes try to find on whatever digital devices it was, what we may be looking for so that they could go ahead and arrest the suspect. So that's huge, though, in your decision in what kind of an extraction that you're going to do, or how you're going to treat this data. Because do I have how many X number of hours to sit there and wait for this? No, I can't sit there like that. So you end up really having to you got a lot of decisions. You got several decision trees that are going on in your own mind here
100%.
on what's the best thing to do.
And that goes into prioritizing devices too. Because I know for CSAM cases, we always wanted to make a same day arrest if we could. So, if you're we wanted to find evidence that would allow us to do that if it existed. So absolutely prioritizing devices and time on scene. Switching
Yes.
just a little bit, if you're talking about, one of the things I look at things from, a supervisory standpoint sometimes, and you're talking about the example of a TV being logged in and you getting pictures, and we're talking about wearables and the reality of seizing or just even looking at all of those things. This is so much work on scene, and the addition of just IoT devices adding more time on scene and the need for possibly more personnel on scene, and the complexity of prioritizing all of those things. It's amazing that the workload that is being that is the reality now.
And then what does that do to us back in the lab? Because, I had a
Right.
case recently.
We're just talking about on scene.
I had a case recently that the
Yeah.
geolocation data wasn't available, the cache locations, and so we only had significant locations, and that was not enough for court. I testified in the case. We had data about geolocation. Had the image been done within 7 days of the arrest, the day of the activity, we would have had those additional location artifacts that would have corroborated the significant locations, and it would have been more valuable in that instance. So by what the court's ruling was. So losing that data by not imaging immediately is dramatically affecting case outcome and what can
We're going
be
back to our
presented in
first
court.
episode.
Yeah,
We're going back
yeah,
to our first
100%. 100%. All right, so you've got these people on scene. So Debbie, who goes there? Does the examiner go there? Does a technician go there? Do we rely on the investigator? Like, how are those decisions made in terms of those roles on scene? What you've got, tools, training, procedures. How are you making that decision?
So if you have all of those things, so on our first episode, you said I had an unlimited budget.
I was very lucky. So working in counterterrorism, which I've done for a lot of my career, the budgets, not to say that they were unlimited, but if I needed something and it was a high enough priority case for national security, we got what we needed in order to protect the nation.
Sure.
But also, and again, working DoD cases, 100% understand the concept of, in the military, we call that time on target. When you have a very, very limited amount of time, but you need to get specific information. So that affects tooling. And you're not putting a forensics examiner necessarily on the front line. They might be in the rear, forward, still in a war zone, but they might not be the person knocking on the door. That might be an operator. And those people need to be able to get information and get it quickly, even though they're not forensics examiners. So how do we deal with that from a tools training, personnel, administrative, planned versus unplanned? I want your thoughts on this whole concept.
So it actually makes me, I don't want to say scared. Scared's not the right word, but worried. There's agencies now that don't have any digital forensics capacity, and build it. If we are saying that acquisition is preservation and that we are recommending you acquiring data on scene for so many reasons, I worry about the agencies and the victims and the people, if we're talking about inculpatory and exculpatory evidence.
Yeah, 100%.
So some agencies are going to be at a disadvantage, and those communities are going to be at a disadvantage because they barely have any capacity at all right now. And now they need to, like you're saying, they need to have the proper tools and the proper personnel with the proper training in order to collect data on scene. They need the tools that will properly acquire and preserve the data on scene. And this is going to be a real challenge. They'll need to develop best practices and proper policies and procedures, because if they don't, the consequences of poor on scene collection is loss of or alteration of critical evidence, compromised admissibility in court, and the impact on justice. Just
100%. I love the fact that you're bringing up exculpatory evidence and the impact on justice. I can't push people enough to look at that SWIG-DE paper, but who's doing the people have to be trained. So with the amount of data, it's hard to take an examiner out of a lab to go acquire the data, right? Because
sure.
we need extremely technical people to be doing the analysis, because I'm sure we'll do an episode on the fact that the data is not always recovered by the tools. We'll put that on our list as well. That, you need to be able to do that deeper analysis. So who winds up doing the acquisitions? I guess it depends on the size of your lab.
It depends on the
team.
size. Absolutely. I know for us now, Kim and I were lucky enough to work for state agencies. And, for us, every search warrant we went on, we took examiners with us.
That's
we probably
awesome.
took at least 2. And yes, it took them out of the lab, but I also think it gave them a perspective and skills that they would not have by always staying in the lab.
But how would we even figure out how we're losing data? That we're talking about this data loss.
Right.
How would we even know if examiners weren't there and seeing those differences, if that makes sense?
We took examiners on scene with us, and we offered that to our local agencies as well. Not everyone is in that situation, but I do think that agencies are going to have to prioritize this specific technology for purchase, because not that this is what our episode is about, but they have limited budgets and they are purchasing license plate readers and drones and body camera. Like, there's all sorts of things, but they are going to have to prioritize acquiring data from mobile devices on scene, my personal opinion, because if they don't, I believe that the time is going to come where they are going to be in trouble because they did not seize evidence that would have exculpatory evidence that would have excluded somebody. Not even just finding the right bad guy, but they are going to miss evidence that would have proved someone's innocence. That is going to be horrible.
I can't cite specific cases, but I've already heard of instances where what we talked about in week 1 has been used by defense to say that the exculpatory evidence isn't present.
Was missing
because the preservation did not occur by acquiring the data quickly enough. So I think it is extraordinarily pertinent that we're doing that. And these roles on scene are hard.
Even if it's not true, it's going to be used as a defense.
So this really, really makes me think, is there a way? So I know tools will do their thing, right? Because we've got tools, training, and people, and tools will do their thing to create tools that are meant for acquisition and are scene friendly. And there's a lot of tools that are designed specifically to be more technician or operator friendly.
Right.
Do you think that there is an opportunity to distinguish a digital forensics technician from a digital forensics examiner and have people who are well trained and equipped so that, yes, maybe your examiners are still rotating out to the field, but to grow this?
Absolutely. I absolutely think that is yes. The answer is yes. The short answer is yes. And I think that also agencies who don't have this capacity now, and they're going to develop this capacity, have a technician to do this, and have an examiner on standby. Like, almost any examiner, we know this community is collaborative. If you called if there is someone trained, say, to the level of what we're calling a technician, and there is an examiner back in the lab, it doesn't even matter if it's the same agency. Call and say, hey, this is the situation I'm in. What is your, do you have any advice for me? I guarantee you that there isn't an examiner in the country that wouldn't answer their questions.
You see it on the listservs, right? So
Absolutely.
HTCIA, ACES. By the way, I love that we have a digital forensics Discord, but remember that the digital forensics Discord can be Anyone can join. So it's
Right.
a great place to ask questions that are technical, but maybe not things that you wouldn't want on the front
Case
page of
specific. Right.
the New York Times. Um, but the private listservs, where the members are vetted and we know that they're professionals in the field, those are great places to just say, hey, does anyone here have, and I see it all the time, information about, you know, how to get data off of, an Aura ring. I was trying to think of something. There's nothing popping in my head. And, then someone can pop up and go, yeah, I do. Please email me directly. And you see a lot of that. And I think that's what's so great about our community is how collaborative it is. And I know we have a planned episode coming up, closer to when a lot of people will be going to more conferences, surrounding how to network with other forensics examiners and build your network. But I think that is really critical, is to build those connections, like you're saying, Debbie, so that you have those people to call
Mm-hmm.
on. And if we're
Yeah.
creating technician roles, I mean, to me, that just seems like a good entryway to have someone start in a technician role and then grow into an examiner role.
Right. Because, in other conversations, we have talked about career paths. And I think it's a great way to go. And I even know some investigators who would want to be trained as a technician and be able to do both roles. So I absolutely think that's one of the great answers for this particular problem.
You mentioned investigators. So I think we were talking about, what's happening on scene. I think that this is a good little point to point out that it's really important that depending on what's going on scene, right, and what's happening here, you may, like oftentimes, and I think, Debbie, you all did very similar, that when you would go for an ICAC or a CSAM case, that there was a suspect that was being interviewed at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
And if an interview is happening at the same time, then what I'm doing from a forensics perspective, that interview may end up with some good information that I need to know. And so oftentimes they would have more than one person sitting in an interview so that there was somebody who could run some information out to me, or whatever examiner,
I
right?
would say vice versa. I've done the same in the military.
It goes both ways.
Where I was providing information to the interviewers to inform
Yes.
the questions so that they, hey, ask them about this. I'm seeing
Right.
this. Hey, do they know John Smith? And see what they say, because they're calling John Smith every day, or whatever the situation is, or tell me about the building with the blue door. Because we saw that they were going to a building with a blue door regularly. But we can, and it turns out it's just where they buy coffee. But no, I'm joking. But the informing the interview and informing the exam, that communication, that is critical. And you can't do that if you're waiting for the data to get back to the lab. Right? Like
Right.
the whole concept of this conversation is frontline digital forensics, right? Like, what do we need to do on scene so that we secure the evidence? But if we have that communication at the front line, wow, that really changes things.
Well, it's a missed opportunity if you're not having those conversations.
It is.
Then at that point, it's a missed opportunity for both of you, for the exam and the investigation. It's
100%.
totally missed opportunities.
100%. Because if you don't know what to ask, and even passwords, I know that sounds silly, but sometimes you find an additional application and you're like, hey, I need the password for this. And a lot of times that can even be, this doesn't need to be adversarial. This could be a consenting witness who is sharing a device with information, and we just need that right now so that we can continue getting that data. So it just, and we might not be able to have that communication later. So it's
right.
really, really important to get that information. I love this. I think that it is really important that we're understanding the criticality of having examiners at the front line, or having personnel who are trained in digital forensics, even if it's more in a technician role at the front line, depending on an agency, so that they're able to acquire the right devices, ensure that we're getting the proper images in the proper order. Please, everyone, look at that SWGDE document that we're contemplating if IoT is relevant to be acquired. Some instances, yes, some instances, no. That we're thinking about loss of data, that we're acknowledging all of those challenges you brought up, Debbie, around being unseen, and that we're really thinking about how these different roles fit together. I think that this is a really important topic that people may not be addressing, and it's really critical to this whole best practices for acquiring and handling and preserving evidence. So if you haven't, not that this entire conversation isn't a prompt for that paper, but the community's really worked hard on that, and it is in draft, and it does need feedback from the community so it can, so that consensus-based document can be made better to provide as a guide. Because to be honest, the document from 2020, 5 years of advances in mobile devices means that document is completely irrelevant today. And that's the other thing, right? We need to, on scene, be responding to the changes.
And they happen fast.
They happen fast. Well, thanks everyone for a great conversation.
It was fun.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for listening. And we look forward to sharing another cool digital content.